And so we come to the end of comic books and graphic novels. But worry not, we still have my favorite creator, Chris Ware, to talk about. Chris Ware started doing comics at the University of Texas at Austin. He was doing a strip for the Daily Texan, which caught the eye of Art Spiegelman and Francoise Mollet. Now, Spiegelman and Mollet were doing Raw magazine at that time. You remember, that was the anthology that followed on Arcade and brought a new sophistication to comics overall. And Spiegelman and Mollet, they included Ware in Raw Volume 2, Issue 3. The great thing is that we now, at this point in the course, know so many of the creators who are included in this issue that thumbing through it is like thumbing through a review of the entire class. Right away, we get this separate story of Crazy Cat and Ignatz. You remember, that's where our course effectively started. And if we go a little further, we come here to the serialized version of Mouse 2. This was printed in 1991, and Mouse 2 was about to come out. And here's chapter 10. And you can see the title page is different from included in the collected edition. And if you page through it, you can see we get that wonderful splash page where the photos literally fall off the page. Then if we go on a little bit more, we see our old friend Brinky Brown by Justin Green. And further still, there's a comic written by Alan Moore. And that's quite exceptional because you don't usually associate Alan Moore with the U.S. underground scene. But there he is with a comic illustrated by Mark Baer. And if you go back, there's a story by Aline Kaminsky. You'll remember her. And we come to Chris Ware's story, I Guess. Now, this story was printed in Raw in black and white in 1991. And a bit later, Ware reprinted the story in his collected edition, Quimby the Mouse. This was printed in the Acme Novelty Library series, an occasional series that Ware produces that collects various strips. And so, I Guess appears in here. Let me see if I can find it. Ah, here it is. Appears in full color, and it really looks gorgeous. So let me read to you. When I was really young, I asked my mom why all old movies were in black and white. She said that back then, everything was in black and white. I took her really literally. And until I was 6 or 7, I thought color was some weird modern invention. I guess I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' house because my mom had to work. I didn't mind at all, though. I liked both of my grandparents a lot. My grandfather was retired, but he still maintained a rigorous daily schedule of yard work. Outside by 9 a.m. and then back in at 5 to bathe, get dressed, watch television, and eat dinner. Sometimes he'd let me help him do stuff, and then we'd both come inside together, and I'd get to take a shower with him. Then we'd watch TV. He had some strange habits, like he'd refuse to leave the house unless his underwear matched the color of his clothes. He had 3 or 4 different outfits, each one with a matching shirt, walking shorts, boxer shorts, and socks. So this is I Guess. And I think it plays upon very clearly 2 different comics genre. On the one hand, it gives us biography, the recollections of a person who's thinking about their childhood. And the voice seems to be a young person reflecting on their grandparents. And then on the other hand, we have a pure superhero story, rendered wonderfully in color, a mansion with lightning, and there, down here, is clearly a mansion similar to Bruce Wayne's as he's pondering the recent horrors of the newspaper. So I Guess creates a tension between 2 different genres. And on one hand, it navigates that tension seamlessly, for the prose just runs along. It runs from this prose box up here, through the title, down into another prose box, right through the dialogue boxes, and onwards. On the other hand, though, the 2 forms of comic books strike a gulf of reality. On the one hand is superhero comics telling a story of adventure. On the other is personal reflection. And that gulf, it reminds me of the gulf of the gutter between panels. It demands that we work the interpretation to understand what's going on. And I think as we think about it, we can see that in fact, the form of the superhero comic complements the prose because superhero comics are nostalgic. The prose is nostalgic for an earlier time in life, a time perhaps when you read superhero comics and believed in them and took it as truth that TV is black and white in the past, so reality was black and white in the past. On the other hand, though, the form and the content create a gulf that is also about the sadness of nostalgia. And here, part of the story is that this is a broken family, a family missing a father. And the superhero stands there as a kind of father, but no real father. And so the comic writes us a series of tensions, a longing. And I would suggest that as much as it rolls along seamlessly, its every step is also painful. It's about the pain of loss. It's about the way we cover that over with superheroes, with stories of ourselves, but never entirely overcome that pain. If we look through this book, Quimby the Mouse, in Acme Novelty Library, I think we can see that it demands interpretation in a number of ways. For instance, if we just go back this one page, we can see here a Jimmy Corrigan story, and then up in the top is Household Hints, number 72. And it's got little scissors around it there, so presumably you could cut it out and save it with the other 71 household hints. And this household hint is, cuts and scrapes to elderly limbs may be temporarily bandaged by cutting the end off an absorbent cotton sock and slipping it over the afflicted area. And there you can see there's a little arrow to show you, just slide it over. And if we look down the Jimmy Corrigan story, we can see it applied. Here, a year or two later, and there's Jimmy reading a comic book. Grandma, what happened? What? Oh, this? It's the craziest thing. I had a Band-Aid on my elbow, but when I went to change it, it just pulled all the skin off with it. Yikes. Ouch. And there, Jimmy takes her into the other room, and you can see here she's bandaged herself, and there's the blood stains in each panel that mirror the blood stains up there. And if we look around this book, we're struck that on the back page, there's the blood stain. And if we look down here, there's the blood stain, there's the blood stain, there's the blood stain. It's as if the blood stains have soaked through. And then if we look through over here, we see there's another blood stain. It's still soaking. And down here seems to, oh, no, there it is again, and again, and again. It's soaking through the pages. So if we turn back now to see, oh, here, no blood. Well, these pages are thick, and no doubt they've absorbed. But of course, they can't absorb it because the blood is part of the story. It's not real blood. So this brings up another issue. It's not just that Ware is using form and content within the confines of an individual story. It's that he's pushing that story across the book itself to suggest that the book is part of the story. Indeed, that the overall story is the book. It's not one story within the book, that the book itself is telling a story of youth, a story of nostalgia, and a story of loss. And I think that this quality of taking the book as an element, a focal element within the story, of the story, colors all of Chris Ware's work. Here's another Acme Novelty Library, and truly an amazing creation. And if we open it up, right away we see, here is some advertisements. And they look very much like comic book advertisements, but they're a parody. Famous name prizes, or cash, the Acme way. And you can see, what are these prizes? Well, there's a tactical carbine in the .223 caliber. There's a Tomahawk cruise missile. And there's a minstrel jazz banjo. Incidentally, Chris Ware is an accomplished blues musician and also a craftsman of some expertise. So if you look around, the parody just gets worse. Here's one of these seed-selling schemes that comics often foisted off on children. Make mistakes, get children, and forever alter the flavor of your life. And if we turn page, it just keeps pouring on. Here's my favorite. Say, gang, don't you think you'd be happier if you had a brand new vroom? You betcha. Who wouldn't be better with a jetmobile? So we go along, enjoying this parody, until we turn the page, and suddenly we're faced with the layout of the cosmos before us. Now, in a way, Chris Ware has drawn this in the Jimmy Corrigan style, and in that way it's parodic, I guess. It fits within the overall statement. But really, I'm just amazed at the beauty. If I roll my hands over this, I see it's all done in raised ink. And the glow-in-the-dark dots, too, they're raised. And it feels very much like a handmade object, even though it's a mass-produced book. And the more I look around, the more I see that. For instance, if I slide this ribbon off, I see on the outside the ribbon just gives me various information. It gives me the title, Acme, and then it has here the barcode and the price. But then just below the price, it has, as if stamped in red, collectors. This copy number is 143,527. So it's stamped as if it's my personal copy. And then when I open it up, I see it reveals a little comic within it. It's actually a comic book of Chris Ware making comics. So it's about the book. It's about making the book. It is the book. So if I lay this ribbon aside for a moment and inspect the book some more, I see here is an actual comic, panel for panel, written on the edge of the binding. Mine's a little bruised here already, but it's written here on the edge of the binding. I would need a magnifying glass to really follow that comic. It's an amazing use of the book as a vehicle for storytelling that actually incorporates the book as a component part. And this bruise, I see here on the edge of my book, I've stained it a little bit. This bruise and the stain, they actually do fit into part of the story of my book. They particularize and individualize my book. And I would say that all of Chris Ware's books are about this way, that the book is part of the story. I have here Jimmy Corrigan, The Smartest Kid on Earth, Chris Ware's masterful long-form novel. And it's a story about young Jimmy Corrigan, he's actually not that young, being reunited with his father. But what I want to pause about is the way the book leads us. The book contains instructions for reading a comic book. And the instructions are tremendously difficult and obscure. And if you can make it through, you're truly a wonderful comic book reader. But it includes even an exam to see if you're proficient. And in the back, the book has a kind of glossary of terms. First, it begins with an apology, and then it has some definitions for us. Metaphor, symbol, simpleton, Ware, Chris, lonely. All of these can be applied to the book. What's interesting to me here is that in a way this book is setting out some terms for us as readers. It's saying that you're not going to make it through this book unless you're prepared to interpret it. And it's throwing us, I think somewhat playful and parodically, it's throwing us some terms to begin our process of interpretation. But that's not all. For if we get into this book here, we see that the cover comes off, and in fact, the cover initially unfolds to appear to be a poster of Jimmy Corrigan. Yet, if we look at it carefully, we see that it's not just a poster, though it is a poster. It's also a cutout statue that you can assemble of Jimmy Corrigan and of his robot alter ego. And if we flip it over, we see that in map form, the inside cover gives us a complete analysis of Jimmy Corrigan's family tree. And so if the story is one of paternity, we can answer the entire story from the start if we study the cover. So I want to pause here and pull together a little bit. Because I think between Raw and the work of Chris Ware and his separate publications, we can begin to understand what gives comics their peculiar energy. For comics invite the reader to cross boundaries. They do that in a very literal way, in that they demand the reader cross the boundary of the gutter and participate in the meaning of the narrative. Participate in imaginatively filling out what happens between those two panels. But I think comics also demand that the reader manipulate the book, that the reader go beyond the simple vessel of prose and begin to work the book, move backwards and forwards and find connections and take it apart. Now, Chris Ware leads us into this. He invites us to see the book as a poetic form that augments its illustrations and its prose. But I think all comics do this. Example. Here is Mark Millar and Brian Hitch's Ultimates. This is actually Ultimates 2, issue 13, the concluding comic of the Mark Millar and Brian Hitch run. And right away we see it's got a cover of Captain America, and that cover is incomplete unless we fold it out, and there we see it's a wraparound cover poster of the Ultimates, looking heroic. Well, that's nothing special. A lot of comics do that, but it's another example of how the book format feeds in to the imaginative play of comic books. But if we open it up, we come to this passage where Captain America assembles the shattered ranks of the Ultimates, and he shouts, "Take 'em down!" And we turn the page to complete the action, and we're faced with advertisements, of course. That's the way comics work. But these advertisements give way. And they give way to something special. As I unfold it here, I see that they give way to the final battle between the Ultimates and the forces, the mythological forces of the underworld. And here we can pick out all the heroes and examine it. And what is this really, this rectangular fold-out, but a work of art? It's a work of illustration, of imaginative art. It's a work that invites us to tarry, to sit with it, to study it, to fill out the action in our imagination. So what I say is that comics cross boundaries. Comics cross boundaries in many ways. They cross the boundaries of the page, moving between panel and panel. They cross the boundaries of the book, allowing us to see the book not just as a vessel for storytelling, but as a poetic object. But comics, they cross more boundaries. And Chris Ware is alive to these as well. For part of what Chris Ware has done is become involved in publishing, republishing older comics. And here we have his edition of Walt and Skeezix. This is Frank O. King's great work from the past. And Ware has seen it through to publication in a kind of Jimmy Corrigan format. Ware has also done a whole Crazy Cat series for Fantagraphics Books. The series editor is Bill Blackbeard, and Jeet Hers also worked on it. And this is really a wonderful collection. You can buy each individual volume that brings Crazy and Ignatz back. So comics cross historical boundaries as well. But most broadly, I've said since the beginning that comics cross boundaries of authority. Comics are iconoclastic in that you need no special license to make comics. You need no special degree. Comics invite free play. They invite a degree of pirating and copying in order to make the story happen. In this, comics are tremendously powerful. But recently, and I think this MOOC is part of this, comics are at a changing phase. For comics are also gaining authority, and as they gain authority, they stop being completely iconoclastic. And they start to fold into authority itself. And so we see at the University of Florida, there's now a comic studies program where you can get a PhD, become a doctor of comics. And there's the Cartoon Center for creating comics in Vermont, where you can get an MFA and be degreed as an artist of comics. And these are good things. They're great things. They signal the sophistication of the form. At the same time, I think they also take away from that anti-authoritarian spirit. They make comics more rigid. Indeed, they make comics part of authority. And in this way, makes me think that comics, too, bring us back to that sense we saw in Joe Sacco's Palestine of no way out. That sense we saw in the Ultimates that everything was about entertainment and mass media. In this, the opening up of comics, the coming of comics to true authority, recognizable as an art form is also a shutting down, a closing up. This brings us to a problem, but I think too that Chris Ware leads us out of this problem. And I have here Chris Ware's building stories, and I'd like to take a moment to look at them and think about how Chris Ware leads us out. And opening up this book, I have what may or may not be the last page of the comic. I'd like to read it to you. It's called Browsing, and it features Chris Ware's nameless main character. I was browsing, but not on the internet, in one of those big chain bookstores that don't exist anymore. And this book caught my eye. So I picked it up, and to my amazement, it was my book. Someone had published my book. Wow. And it had everything in it. My diaries, the stories from my writing classes, even stuff I didn't know I'd written. Everything I'd forgotten, abandoned, or thrown out was there. Everything. And you know, it wasn't so bad. In fact, it was kind of good. Interesting. All the illustrations, and there were a lot of them, there seemed to be more and more the more I looked, were so precise and clean. It was like an architect had drawn them. They were so colorful and intricate. That's weird. I can't draw like this. And it wasn't, I don't know, it wasn't really a book either. It was in pieces, like books falling apart out of a carton maybe. It was beautiful. It made sense. Why are you laughing at me? Because your dreams are always so retarded, Mom. Come on, so obvious. You're an architect? I know, but the point is I dreamed it. I saw it, made it, with my own two eyes. Oh, you're young. You don't know what it's like yet to completely give up on something. Oh, Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to laugh. You know there's never been a better mom in the world. And what do you mean give up? You've got your own business, Mom. Oh, I know. I'm sorry. I'm fine. Like I said, I think it's great you want to go to art school. It's just when you're young, you don't know what to do with. I just never had any confidence in. I just never thought I had it in me. That's all. You know? I never thought I actually had it in me. The story, the page, is a poem on artistic creation. And it begins with the main character's discovery of her own book in a bookstore. And in that, it recalls for me the sense that books have their own lives. They go their own way and they meet their own readers regardless of the maker's intention. In the second tier, we discover that the book is different than normal books. It's a carton of pieces, and really, that's what Chris Ware has created here in building stories. And if we open this carton, we find that it contains many, many different pieces. Here's Branford Bee, a little storybook about bees. And then here's a more traditional sized comic about the building of building stories. And it too has a beautiful layout, but it is maybe a little bit more traditional. And here's another one. This one is actually my favorite, this hardbound collection of stories. But it keeps going. Each comic is its own size and shape. Here's little flip books that come open to tell extended strips. And there's more of those. And this is a more flip book proper. Little collection of stories. Here's a very beautifully golden bound book, lit story. It's done on a smaller scale and tighter. This is an amazing fold out of the primary building of building stories. And it's almost a game board. And it goes on. The stories get bigger, they get smaller. They're in different formats. I'll show you one last one here, if I can get it out. It's a little bit tightly wedged. But this is truly, truly bigger than newspaper size. Barely fits in the box. And it's wonderful A wonderful comic overall. And so when I say that browsing is perhaps the last story, I underscore a point of building stories. For this is a book as artifacts for us to assemble into a narrative format. It asks us, which comes first? Which comes last? How does the story work overall? What meaning the separate formats of each element? How does that format contribute to the story it tells? So if the beginning of browsing tells us a story about books leaving their creators, the second tier advances that story to remind us that books need readers and that those readers interpret those books differently. But the third tier blows it all apart and makes it just a dream. A book never written, never collected, a story untold. And the fourth tier complicates that. For on the one hand, it introduces the daughter's desire to go to art school, to gain the authority and skills to learn to make art. But it leaves us, too, with the narrator's self-censorship, her own lack of confidence, her sense that she couldn't make art. I just never thought I had it in me. I never thought I actually had it in me. And so we come to the sense of dead ends, that for her, there was no way out. She had the stories. In her dreams, she knew she could make those stories, but she never had the confidence to execute it. And so she blocked herself and remained without making that book. This is a great sadness. But I think that if we look back on the great comics we've read, we see that many of them urge us otherwise. Alison Bechtel's story, Fun Home, her father tells us, just write down what's happening. And Françoise Mollet in Mouse, Volume 2, she tells Artie, just keep it honest. These are stories which say, just make art. They cut through the complexity. They cut through the authority. And they say, just make art. No matter what difficulties your life faces, no matter the situation you find yourself, it is never too late and never impossible. Have confidence. Be brave. Whatever happens, you can always imagine. You can always imagine possibilities. You can always tell stories, for art is generative. And so there is always hope. Onwards.